The unexpected prize. Jake Morrison had always lived on the fringes of the galaxy, a small-time space trader barely scraping by. His ship, the Stellar Wind, was an old freighter that rattled with every jump through hyperspace. This life wasn't glamorous, but it kept him far from trouble. Or so he thought. Today, trouble came knocking in the most unexpected way. Jake found himself in a crowded, dimly lit auction hall on a backwater trading post. The air was thick with the smell of exotic spices and engine oil, and alien voices filled the room, speaking languages he could barely understand. He hadn't planned to be here. In fact, he had only stopped to refuel and grab supplies. But a curious announcement over the comm system had lured him in. Rare and one-of-a-kind items. Don't miss your chance. He was no collector, but curiosity got the better of him. The auction was chaotic, with strange artifacts, shimmering crystals, and even ancient weapons displayed for the highest bidders. Jake stood at the back, arms crossed, wondering how anyone could waste so much money on useless trinkets. He was about to leave when the room suddenly fell silent. And now, the auctioneer's voice boomed, the final item of the evening. A treasure unlike any other in the galaxy. A spotlight illuminated the stage, revealing a glass chamber. Inside stood a figure that made Jake's breath catch. She was humanoid but undeniably alien. Her skin shimmered like silver under moonlight, and her eyes glowed faintly, a mesmerizing shade of violet. Long, flowing hair framed her delicate features. She was beautiful, but there was something haunting in the way she stood, head bowed and shoulders slumped. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some awestruck, others whispering sinister intentions. Jake's stomach churned as he realized the treasure wasn't an artifact. It was a living being. The starting bid is 500,000 credits, the auctioneer announced with a wide grin. Jake stepped back, wanting no part of this. He wasn't a hero, but he wasn't a monster either. Buying and selling people, alien or not, was crossing a line he'd never touch. Yet as he turned to leave, his boot caught on a loose wire, and he stumbled. His hand slammed against the touch panel in front of him. The screen lit up with a confirmation. Bid accepted. 600,000 credits. What? No. Wait a second. Jake shouted, waving his hands. But it was too late. The auctioneer's grin widened as he pointed at Jake. Sold. To the human in the back, the auctioneer declared. Jake's face turned pale as every eye in the room swiveled toward him. He felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. I don't have that kind of money, he protested. The auctioneer chuckled darkly. Payment isn't due until you take possession of the prize. But let me warn you, her former owner won't be pleased. Jake's heart raced. Former owner. What had he gotten himself into? Before he could respond, 2 hulking guards escorted the glass chamber toward him. The alien girl inside lifted her gaze, meeting Jake's eyes for the first time. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and fear, and Jake felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't meant to bid, but now she was looking at him like he was her only hope. The auctioneer leaned closer, lowering his voice. Good luck, human. You'll need it. As the transaction concluded, alarms blared across the trading post. A voice crackled over the intercom. Alert. Unauthorized ships entering orbit. The crowd scattered in panic, and Jake seized the moment to act. Come on, he shouted to the girl, smashing the control panel on her chamber. The glass hissed open, and she stepped out hesitantly. Do you want to stay here? Jake asked urgently. She shook her head, her glowing eyes narrowing with determination. Without another word, she followed him through the chaos. Blaster fire echoed in the corridors as Jake led her to the Stellar Wind. His ship wasn't much, but it was fast enough to get them out of here. As they boarded, she finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. My name is Lyra. You've made a dangerous enemy today. Jake powered up the engines, glancing at her with a grim smile. Story of my life. As the ship lifted off, Jake glanced at the radar. Several ships were in pursuit, and they were armed to the teeth. Hang on, he shouted, pulling the stellar wind into a sharp climb. The trading post shrank behind them as they entered the cold expanse of space. Lyra clutched the edge of a console, her violet eyes locked on Jake. "You shouldn't have saved me." Jake grinned despite the danger. "I didn't save you. I just accidentally bought you." Her lips twitched, almost forming a smile. But her expression darkened as she whispered, "He'll never stop hunting us." Jake didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. The look in her eyes told him enough. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Escape from the auction. The stellar wind shook violently as blaster fire rained down from the pursuing ships. Jake cursed under his breath, gripping the controls tightly. This wasn't how he had planned to spend his evening. Dodging plasma bolts while an alien girl with glowing eyes sat silently behind him, clutching the seat like her life depended on it. "Hold on," Jake shouted over the deafening alarms as he pulled the ship into a sharp dive. The maneuver barely avoided a direct hit, the plasma bolt streaking past the cockpit window. Lyra, seated in the co-pilot's chair, watched the chaos unfold with an eerie calmness, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "They're not going to stop," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Yeah, I kind of figured that out," Jake snapped, glancing at her. "Care to explain who exactly they are?" "Not now." Lyra shot back, her glowing eyes narrowing. "Focus on not getting us killed." The stellar wind jolted again as another shot grazed the hull. Jake grimaced. The shields wouldn't hold much longer. He needed a plan. Fast. Scanning the radar, he noticed a nearby asteroid field. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being a sitting duck. "Hang tight," he muttered, punching the throttle. The engines roared, propelling the ship toward the cluster of massive jagged rocks floating in space. "What are you doing?" Lyra asked, her voice rising with alarm. "Improvising," Jake replied. The ship plunged into the asteroid field, weaving between the colossal rocks. The pursuing ships followed, their weapons blazing. Jake's hands flew across the controls, his years of piloting small freighters finally paying off. The stellar wind ducked and dodged, narrowly avoiding collisions as Jake pushed the ship to its limits. "They're still on us," Lyra yelled, gripping the armrests of her seat. Jake gritted his teeth. "I can see that. Unless you've got some magic trick up your sleeve, we're going to have tow." Before he could finish, Lyra closed her eyes and pressed her hands together. A faint glow began to emanate from her palms, growing brighter by the second. Jake spared her a quick glance, his eyes widening. "What are you?" The glow intensified, and suddenly, a wave of energy burst from her hands, spreading out in all directions. The pursuing ships wobbled, their systems momentarily disrupted. One veered off course, crashing into an asteroid with a fiery explosion. Jake blinked, stunned. "Okay, that's a neat trick." Lyra's breathing was labored, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead. "It won't hold them for long," she said, her voice strained. "They'll adapt." "Great," Jake muttered, steering the ship toward the edge of the asteroid field. "Any other surprises you want to tell me about?" Lyra didn't respond, her glowing eyes fixed on the radar. The remaining ships were regaining control, closing in fast. Jake's mind raced. He needed to lose them for good. Then he saw it, a derelict freighter drifting just beyond the asteroid field. Its massive hull provided enough cover to hide, at least temporarily. "Hold on," he said, guiding the stellar wind toward the wreckage. The ship slid into a shadowed crevice, engines powering down to minimal output. Jake killed the lights and held his breath. The pursuing ships roared past, their scanners failing to detect the hidden vessel. Jake exhaled, slumping back in his seat. "That was too close," he muttered. Lyra didn't reply. She was staring out the window, her expression distant. Jake turned to her, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. "Okay, spill," he said. "Who are these guys, and why are they so hell-bent on killing us?" Lyra hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. "They're not here to kill me. They're here to take me back." Back to who? Jake pressed. She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. To my owner. The one you stole me from. Jake frowned. I didn't steal you. That auction was rigged. I didn't even want to bid. Lyra's lips twitched, almost forming a bitter smile. It doesn't matter. To him, you're a thief, and thieves pay with their lives. Jake leaned back, rubbing his temples. This was worse than he'd thought. He hadn't just made enemies. He'd made enemies with someone powerful enough to send a small fleet after them. Who is this guy? He asked finally. Lyra hesitated again before answering. His name is Torvik. He's one of the most feared warlords in the galaxy. Jake's heart sank. Of course, it couldn't just be a random rich alien. It had to be a warlord. What does he want with you? Jake asked. Lyra's glowing eyes darkened. I'm the last of my kind. My DNA. It's valuable. Torvik wants to use me to create weapons. Biological weapons. Jake stared at her, a mix of anger and disbelief washing over him. That's insane. Lyra nodded. And now you're caught in the middle. Jake let out a long sigh. Well, I guess there's no turning back now. For the first time, Lyra looked at him with something resembling gratitude. You didn't have to help me. You could have left me back there. Jake shrugged, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, well, I'd always been bad at making smart decisions. Lyra almost smiled, but her expression quickly grew serious again. Torvik won't stop. He'll keep coming. Jake nodded grimly. Then we'd better stay one step ahead. The ship remained silent as the two of them prepared for what was sure to be a long, dangerous journey ahead. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound as the stellar winds slipped away from the wreckage, disappearing into the vastness of space. Secrets of the alien girl. The stellar wind floated silently in the void, hidden amidst the wreckage of a forgotten asteroid mining operation. Jake paced the cramped cockpit, his boots clanging softly against the metal floor. He glanced at Lyra, who sat cross-legged on the co-pilot's seat, staring out the viewport with a faraway look in her glowing violet eyes. So, let's recap, Jake said, breaking the silence. You're being hunted by a warlord named Torvik because you're the last of your kind, and he wants to use you to make what? Super weapons. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Her fingers traced patterns in the condensation on the window, her mind clearly elsewhere. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It's not just about weapons, she said. My kind. We were created for a purpose. Jake stopped pacing and leaned against the console, folding his arms. Created? You mean, like, engineered? Lyra nodded, her gaze still fixed on the stars outside. We were bioengineered by a species long extinct. The creators wanted beings who could channel pure energy. They called us seraphs. Seraphs, Jake repeated, raising an eyebrow. Sounds fancy. It wasn't, Lyra said bitterly. We were tools. Weapons, slaves, experiments, whatever they needed us to be. Over centuries, our creators disappeared, but they left behind their legacy, us. Jake frowned, processing the revelation. And now Torvik wants to use you for the same thing. Lyra finally turned to face him, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance. Torvik doesn't understand what he's dealing with. The power he seeks, it's not something anyone should have. Jake snorted. Yeah, well, I've met enough power-hungry types to know they never listen to reason. Lyra looked down at her hands, which rested on her lap. Her fingers twitched, and faint trails of light began to shimmer along her skin, like veins of liquid silver. Jake's eyes widened. What's that? He asked, stepping closer. It's part of me, Lyra said hesitantly. My energy. It reacts to my emotions. That's why I was able to disable those ships earlier. But she trailed off, biting her lip. But what? Jake prompted. She shook her head. It's dangerous, unstable. If I lose control, people get hurt. Jake tilted his head, studying her. That's why you looked so drained after you used it. Lyra nodded. It's like burning a candle from both ends. The more I use it, the more it consumes me. Jake let out a low whistle. And Torvik wants to mass-produce that. No wonder he's willing to chase us halfway across the galaxy. Silence settled over the cockpit again, the weight of the conversation sinking in. Jake ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even particularly noble. But something about Lyra's story struck a chord with him. She wasn't just running for her life. She was fighting to preserve what little remained of her people. So, Jake said finally, what's the plan? You've been running from this guy for who knows how long. You have a safe place, a home. Lyra's expression darkened. I haven't had a home in years. Torvik destroyed it. Jake winced. Ouch. Sorry I asked. I've been searching for a sanctuary, Lyra continued. There's a place, an ancient station hidden deep in the Andurian Nebula. It's said to be a relic of the creators, protected by technology even Torvik can't penetrate. Jake raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a fairy tale. Maybe, Lyra admitted, but it's my only hope. If I can reach it, I might find answers, or at least a way to stop Torvik. Jake scratched his chin, considering her words. The Andurian Nebula. That's a long way from here. And crawling with pirates, smugglers, and who knows what else. I know, Lyra said, but I have no choice. Jake sighed. Well, lucky for you, I'm already knee-deep in this mess. Might as well see it through. Lyra blinked, surprise flickering across her face. You'd help me. Let's just say I have a hard time walking away from someone in trouble, Jake said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Besides, if Torvik catches you, he'll come after me next. So really, I'm just being selfish. Lyra's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. Thank you, Jake. Don't thank me yet, he said, turning back to the console. First, we got to get out of this wreckage without drawing attention. Then we'll figure out how to survive the next 24 hours. As Jake powered up the ship, a sudden alert blared through the cockpit. A proximity warning flashed on the display. Lyra leaned forward, her glowing eyes narrowing. What is it? She asked. Jake's face paled as he read the radar. Looks like Torvik's bounty hunters found us. The cockpit's viewport lit up with the glow of incoming ships, their weapons already locked onto the stellar wind. Jake clenched his jaw and gripped the controls. Guess we're skipping the quiet exit, he muttered. Hold on, Lyra. This is going to get messy. Lyra placed a hand on the console, her skin glowing faintly. Just keep us moving. I'll do the rest. Jake nodded, adrenaline surging through him. Together, they were about to take on the galaxy's most dangerous hunters, and Jake had a feeling this was only the beginning. A dangerous alliance. The stellar wind limped into orbit around a barren, gray moon. It told scorched from the relentless pursuit. Jake's hands trembled as he adjusted the controls, the adrenaline of their escape still coursing through him. He glanced over at Lyra, who sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her glowing eyes dim and her expression unreadable. That was too close, Jake muttered, leaning back in his chair. The ship's systems beeped weakly, struggling to keep up after the beating they'd taken. If we keep this up, we won't last another encounter. Lyra didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the viewport, where the surface of the moon loomed closer. Its desolate terrain was littered with jagged rocks and deep craters. Jake sighed, realizing she was probably as shaken as he was. We need supplies, Jake continued, more to himself than her. Repairs, fuel, and maybe a miracle. There's a settlement on the dark side of the moon, Lyra said suddenly, her voice calm but resolute. Smugglers, outlaws, people who don't ask questions. We might find what we need there. Jake raised an eyebrow. Smugglers? Sounds like the kind of place where trouble finds you. Lyra turned to him, her glowing eyes narrowing. Do you have a better idea? He didn't. With a resigned sigh, Jake set the ship on a course for the settlement, hoping that whoever they encountered wouldn't recognize their faces or their ship. The settlement was a cluster of ramshackle buildings built into the side of a massive crater, their metal walls glowing faintly under the harsh moonlight. Jake brought the stellar wind down carefully onto a makeshift landing pad, the ship's landing gear groaning in protest. "Stay close," Jake said as they stepped out onto the dusty ground. The air was thin but breathable, and the settlement streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional hum of machinery. He could feel Lyra's presence behind him, her movements silent but deliberate. They entered a dimly lit cantina, the kind of place where deals were made with a handshake and a blaster under the table. The patrons, a mix of rough-looking aliens and humans, barely glanced at them as they made their way to the bar. Jake leaned on the counter, addressing the grizzled bartender. "I'm looking for a mechanic." The bartender snorted, his three eyes narrowing. "Aren't we all?" Jake slid a small pouch of credits across the counter. The bartender's demeanor changed instantly, his lips curling into a crooked smile. "Doc 12, he said, jerking a thumb toward the back. "Ask for bricks." "Thanks," Jake said, turning to leave. As they exited the cantina, Jake noticed Lyra's tense posture. Her glowing eyes scanned the streets, her body coiled like a spring ready to snap. "Relax," Jake said. "We're just here for repairs." "This place feels wrong," Lyra murmured. "We shouldn't linger." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but a voice interrupted him. Well, look who decided to show up." Jake froze. The voice was familiar, and not in a good way. He turned slowly to see a tall, wiry man leaning against a nearby wall, a sly grin on his face. It was Garrick, an old business associate Jake hadn't seen in years. "Garrick," Jake said, forcing a smile. "What a surprise." Garrick chuckled, pushing off the wall and strolling toward them. "Didn't think I'd run into you out here, Jake. You owe me." Jake stiffened. Garrick wasn't the kind of guy who forgot a debt, or forgave one. "Look, I'm a little busy right now," Jake said, trying to keep his tone light. "Maybe we can catch up later." Garrick's grin widened. "Oh, I think we'll catch up right now. You see, I heard a rumor that you've got something valuable on your ship, something Torvik wants." Jake's blood ran cold. He shot a glance at Lyra, whose glowing eyes had darkened with suspicion. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping in. Garrick's expression hardened. "Don't play dumb with me, Jake. Torvik's offering a fortune for that girl. Hand her over, and maybe I won't turn you in." Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the blaster at his side. "Not happening." Before Garrick could respond, Lyra stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but laced with steel. "If you know what's good for you, you'll walk away." Garrick laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "What's a little thing like you gonna do? I've got half the settlement backing me up." Lyra's eyes flared brightly, and a faint hum filled the air. Garrick's grin faltered as the glow spread across her body, illuminating the dark street. Jake took a step back, his heart pounding. "Lyra, maybe don't." But it was too late. With a wave of her hand, a burst of energy erupted, sending Garrick and his cronies flying backward. The streetlights flickered, and a hush fell over the settlement as everyone turned to see the source of the commotion. Lyra's glow faded, and she stumbled slightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Jake caught her arm, steadying her. "We need to go." "Now," he said, his voice urgent. They hurried back to the stellar wind, Jake's mind racing. Garrick wouldn't let this go, and now the entire settlement knew they were here. As the ship lifted off, Jake glanced at Lyra. "You really know how to make friends," he said, his tone half-joking. Lyra's expression was unreadable. "We can't trust anyone. Not here, not anywhere." Jake sighed, setting a course for the Andurian Nebula. "Then it's just us against the galaxy." The ship disappeared into the void, leaving the smuggler's moon and its dangers. Behind. The warlord's ultimatum. The stellar wind glided through the cold expanse of space, its engines humming steadily after the hurried repairs. Jake sat in the cockpit, staring blankly at the radar. The tension in the ship was palpable, a thick silence hanging between him and Lyra. She was in the cargo bay, meditating, or so she called it. Jake had learned not to disturb her when the faint glow of her energy began to pulse through the walls. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. They'd escaped the smugglers, barely repaired the ship, and had no clear plan beyond running. And yet, for all their scrambling, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. A soft beep from the console shattered his thoughts. Jake frowned, leaning forward. A signal, encrypted and broadcasting directly to the stellar wind. His heart sank. This was no random communication. The screen flickered to life, revealing a face that sent a chill down his spine. Torvik. The warlord's features were sharp and reptilian, his scaled skin glinting under dim lighting. His yellow eyes bore into Jake with a predator's intensity, and his thin lips curled into a cruel smile. Jake Morrison. Torvik's deep, gravelly voice rumbled. I must commend you. Few have dared to defy me, and even fewer have lived long enough to regret it. Jake's mouth went dry. He forced a grin, leaning closer to the screen. Hey, Torvik. Nice to meet you. Big fan of your reputation. Torvik's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Spare me your wit, human. We both know why I'm here. Jake leaned back, crossing his arms. Do we? Because I'm just a humble trader trying to make an honest living. Don't insult my intelligence. Torvik growled. You have something that belongs to me. Jake's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the cargo bay door, where he knew Lyra was listening, even if she pretended not to. She doesn't belong to anyone. Torvik chuckled darkly. Ah, the righteous speech. How noble of you. But let me make this simple. Hand her over, and I'll consider sparing your life. Generous offer, Jake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But I think I'll pass. The warlord's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. Do you have any idea what you're protecting, human? She is no innocent. She is a weapon. A danger to everyone around her. Even you. Jake's fists clenched. You mean she's a danger to you? That's why you're so desperate to get her back. Torvik's lips curled into a snarl. You're playing a dangerous game, Morrison. I don't need to warn you what happens to those who stand in my way. The screen flickered, and suddenly, the view shifted to show a fleet of massive warships emerging from hyperspace. They were unmistakably Torvik's, sleek, black vessels bristling with weapons. Jake's stomach twisted as the fleet surrounded the stellar wind, their ominous silhouettes filling the viewport. I could destroy you with a single command, Torvik said, his voice like ice. But I prefer to give you a choice. Surrender the girl, or watch your ship, and your life, turn to ash. Jake's mind raced. He had no chance against that kind of firepower. But surrendering Lyra, that wasn't an option. He straightened, forcing a cocky grin. You really know how to make a guy feel special, Torvik. But if you think I'm just going to roll over and hand her to you, you don't know me very well. Torvik's eyes gleamed with amusement. Courageous. Foolish, but courageous. I'll give you 1 hour to reconsider. After that, there will be no mercy. The transmission ended, leaving the cockpit in eerie silence. Jake slumped back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. I assume you're not going to surrender me, Lyra's voice said, breaking the silence. Jake turned to see her standing in the doorway, her glowing eyes fixed on him. She looked calm, but there was an edge to her tone. Not a chance, Jake said firmly. We'll find a way out of this. Lyra stepped closer, her expression softening. You don't have to do this, Jake. Torvik will stop at nothing. You've already risked too much. Jake stood, meeting her gaze. Listen, I don't know why I keep throwing myself into danger for you. Maybe it's because I hate bullies, Or maybe it's because I'm an idiot. But I'm not giving up. Not on you. For a moment, Lyra looked as if she might argue. Then she sighed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You're a strange human, Jake Morrison. I get that a lot, he said, flashing her a grin. Now let's figure out how to outsmart a warlord. As the clock ticked down, Jake and Lyra worked together, analyzing the fleet's formation and the stellar wind's meager capabilities. Lyra suggested using her energy to create a temporary cloaking field, but it would require perfect timing, and it would drain her completely. It's risky, Jake said, studying the holographic display. But it's our best shot. Lyra nodded, her glowing eyes determined. Then let's make it count. As the fleet began to close in, the stellar wind powered up, its engines roaring to life. Jake gripped the controls, adrenaline surging through him. Lyra stood beside him, her hands glowing with a radiant energy that lit up the cockpit. Here we go, Jake muttered. The ship shot forward, heading straight for the fleet. Torvik's warships opened fire, their plasma cannons lighting up the void. But just as the blasts closed in, Lyra unleashed a burst of energy, cloaking the ship in a shimmering field. Jake maneuvered the stellar wind through the chaos, weaving between the massive warships as alarms blared on their scanners. The cloaking field faltered, but it held long enough for Jake to find a gap in the fleet's formation. Hold on, he shouted, punching the throttle. The ship rocketed past the warships and into hyperspace, leaving Torvik's fleet scrambling in its wake. As the stars blurred into streaks of light, Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Lyra collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, her glow fading. Jake glanced at her, relief flooding his face. We did it, he said. For now, Lyra replied, her voice weak but steady. Torvik won't give up. Jake nodded grimly. Then we'll be ready. The stellar wind sped through the void, two unlikely allies against the galaxy's most relentless enemy. The final stand. The stellar wind emerged from hyperspace into the dense blue haze of the Andurian Nebula. The swirling clouds of ionized particles reflected faintly on the ship's hull, giving it an otherworldly glow. Jake stared at the nebula's beauty for a brief moment, then glanced at the console. Warnings flashed across the screen, indicating dangerously high levels of interference from the nebula's radiation. This place is a death trap, Jake muttered, adjusting the shields to compensate. Are you sure this is where we need to be? Lyra, sitting in the co-pilot's chair, nodded. Her glowing eyes were dim, her exhaustion evident after their last escape. The Creator's sanctuary is deep within the nebula. If it still exists, it's our only chance to stop Torvik. Jake sighed, gripping the controls tightly. If we don't fry ourselves first. The ship navigated cautiously through the nebula, the turbulence shaking its battered frame. Every few minutes, Jake's sensors flickered, unable to provide a clear reading of their surroundings. It felt like flying blind, and he hated it. Just as he was about to complain again, a blip appeared on the radar. Then another, and another. Lyra, Jake said, his voice tense. We've got company. She leaned over, her expression hardening as she saw the data. Torvik's ships had found them, cutting through the nebula with alarming precision. The largest ship, unmistakably Torvik's flagship, loomed like a dark shadow on the edge of the sensors. He's here, Lyra whispered. Jake's heart raced. How are they even tracking us in this soup? They must have planted a tracer during our last encounter, Lyra said, her glowing eyes narrowing. We need to lose them. Jake pushed the stellar wind harder, weaving through the swirling clouds. The smaller ships were faster, closing the distance with every second. Plasma bolts streaked past them, lighting up the nebula in flashes of orange and blue. Hold on, Jake shouted, yanking the controls into a sharp dive. The ship barely avoided a cluster of jagged rocks hidden within the haze. Lyra closed her eyes, placing her hands on the console. A faint glow spread across the ship, and for a brief moment, the turbulence eased. I can cloak us again, she said, her voice strained. "But it won't last long." "Do it," Jake said without hesitation. Lyra focused, and the ship shimmered, disappearing from the sensors. Jake maneuvered them into a dense cloud of ionized gas, hoping the interference would keep them hidden. The pursuing ships slowed, scanning the area with broad sweeps. But the reprieve was short-lived. Torvek's voice crackled over the comm system, his tone dripping with menace. "You can't hide forever, Lyra. You should know by now. I always find what's mine." Jake muted the transmission, gritting his teeth. This guy really knows how to ruin a mood. Lyra opened her eyes, her glow fading. "He's right. We can't outrun him forever." "Then we don't," Jake said, his voice firm. "We make a stand." The plan. The ship drifted into a vast open space within the nebula, where the swirling clouds parted to reveal a massive, ancient structure. It was the Sanctuary, an enormous, ring-shaped station built into the remains of an asteroid. Its surface was covered in strange symbols that pulsed faintly with light. "This is it," Lyra said, awe in her voice. "The Creator's Sanctuary." Jake didn't have time to marvel. The radar lit up again as Torvek's fleet closed in. "If we're doing this, we need to act fast." Lyra nodded. "The station's core is still active. If I can connect to it, I might be able to amplify my energy and disable Torvek's fleet." "Sounds like a plan," Jake said. "Except for the part where we get shot to pieces before you finish." He glanced at the weapon systems, which were barely functional after their last skirmish. The stellar wind wasn't built for combat, but it would have to do. "You get to the core," Jake said. "I'll hold them off." Lyra hesitated. "Jake." "No arguments," he cut her off. "You're the only one who can do this. I'll buy you as much time as I can." Her glowing eyes softened, and for a moment, Jake thought she might protest. But then she nodded, her determination returning. "Don't die." "Not planning on it," Jake said with a grin. The battle. As Lyra disappeared into the sanctuary, Jake powered up the ship's meager weapons and turned to face the incoming fleet. The first wave of fighters descended on him, their plasma cannons blazing. Jake twisted the controls, the ship rolling to avoid the barrage. "Come on, you bastards," he muttered, firing back with the ship's lasers. He managed to clip one of the smaller ships, sending it spiraling into the nebula. But the odds were stacked against him. The flagship loomed closer, its massive cannons charging for a devastating shot. Jake's ship shook violently as another blast struck the rear shields. In the sanctuary, Lyra reached the core, a glowing crystalline structure that pulsed with ancient energy. She placed her hands on it, and the entire station seemed to come alive. Symbols on the walls lit up, and a low hum filled the air. "I need more time," she whispered, her energy merging with the core. Back outside, Jake's situation was growing desperate. The stellar wind's shields were failing, and smoke filled the cockpit. He could see Torvek's flagship charging its main weapon, ready to finish him off. "Any time now, Lyra," he muttered, gripping the controls. The turning point. Just as the flagship fired, a wave of energy erupted from the sanctuary, spreading across the nebula like a shockwave. The pursuing ships froze in place, their systems overloaded by the burst of power. The flagship's weapon fizzled out, leaving it vulnerable. Jake stared in awe as the enemy fleet faltered. "Lyra, you did it." Inside the sanctuary, Lyra collapsed to her knees, her glow fading completely. The effort had drained her, but she had succeeded. The core's energy had disrupted Torvek's fleet, buying them precious time. Jake didn't waste it. He fired the ship's engines, speeding toward the sanctuary. The flagship's systems began to recover, and Torvek's furious voice echoed over the comms. "This isn't over, Morrison." Jake smirked. "It is for today." The stellar wind docked with the sanctuary, and Jake rushed to Lyra's side. She looked up at him weakly, her eyes dim but alive. "You're insane," she said with a faint smile. "Yeah," Jake replied, helping her to her feet. But it worked. The sanctuary's ancient systems hummed around them, a temporary haven in the vast, dangerous galaxy. But Jake knew their fight wasn't over. Torvik would regroup, and the chase would continue. For now, though, they had won. "Rest up, Lyra," Jake said, his voice soft but firm. "We're going to need all the strength we can get for what's coming next. Freedom at a cost." The sanctuary's vast halls were silent, the only sound coming from the faint hum of ancient energy pulsing through its crystalline core. Jake walked slowly, his boots echoing against the smooth metallic floor. Lyra leaned on him for support, her glowing eyes dim, her energy spent. The battle outside had left both of them physically and emotionally drained. "We can't stay here forever," Jake said, breaking the silence. He glanced at her, concern etched on his face. "Torvik's fleet might be down, but he's not going to give up." Lyra nodded weakly. "The sanctuary's power. It bought us time. But you're right. He'll regroup. He always does." Jake helped her into a small chamber near the core. The room was lined with intricate carvings and softly glowing symbols that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Lyra's faint energy. She sank onto a low bench, her head resting against the wall. "You need to rest," Jake said, crouching in front of her. "I'll figure out our next move." Lyra reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it stopped him in his tracks. "Jake," she said softly, "this isn't your fight. You've already risked everything for me. You don't have to keep going." Jake met her gaze, his expression hardening. "I'm not walking away now. You think I've come this far just to give up?" Her lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're stubborn. You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who would have fought just as hard." Jake sat back on his heels, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Who?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze distant. "My brother," she said finally. "He was the last of our kind to fight against Torvik before I was captured. He sacrificed himself to keep me alive." Jake's chest tightened at the weight of her words. "Then we owe it to him to finish this." Lyra's eyes shimmered faintly as she nodded, her determination returning. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said, her voice steadying. "The sanctuary isn't just a hiding place. It holds a weapon, one created by the same beings who made me. It's why Torvik has been hunting this place for so long." Jake's eyebrows shot up. "A weapon? Why didn't you mention this earlier?" "Because it's not a weapon in the traditional sense," Lyra explained. "It's a choice. It amplifies the energy of anyone who connects to it, but at a cost. Whoever uses it won't survive." Jake's stomach dropped. "You're saying you'd have to?" "Yes," she said simply. "It's why my people never used it. It's a last resort." Jake stood, pacing the room. "There's got to be another way. We've made it this far without throwing your life away." Lyra looked down at her hands, her glowing veins barely visible. "If Torvik regains control, he'll use me to finish what he started. Millions will die, Jake. Maybe more. If my life can stop that, then it's a price I'm willing to pay." Jake clenched his fists, anger and helplessness warring within him. "There has to be another way," he repeated, his voice firm. "We're not giving up yet." The final confrontation. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of alarms blaring through the sanctuary. Jake's communicator buzzed, and a distorted voice came through. "This is Torvik. Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" Jake grabbed his blaster and turned to Lyra. "Stay here. I'll deal with him." "No," Lyra said, standing despite her exhaustion. "This ends now. Together." Jake didn't argue. He knew there was no stopping her when she made up her mind. The two of them hurried to the sanctuary's central chamber, where Torvik's forces were already breaching the outer walls. The air was thick with tension as the massive warlord entered, flanked by heavily armed guards. "Ah, there you are," Torvik said, his reptilian grin spreading wide. "Did you really think this place could protect you?" Jake stepped forward, blaster in hand. You're not taking her." Torvik laughed, a deep, guttural sound. Brave words from a man with no army, no allies, and no hope. Lyra stepped forward, her glow intensifying. "You'll regret underestimating us." The air crackled as her energy pulsed outward, creating a barrier that held Torvik's guards at bay. The warlord's grin faltered as he felt the power radiating from her. "You'd sacrifice yourself to stop me," he sneered. "How noble. How foolish." Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she turned to Jake, her expression softening. "Thank you, Jake, for everything." Before he could stop her, she placed her hands on the sanctuary's core. The entire chamber lit up, the ancient energy surging through her. Symbols on the walls blazed with light, and the sanctuary began to hum with a deafening resonance. "No," Jake shouted, rushing toward her, but an invisible force held him back. Lyra's voice echoed through the chamber, amplified by the energy. "Torvik, your reign ends here." The light intensified, blinding everyone in the room. Jake shielded his eyes, his heart pounding. When the glow subsided, the chamber was silent. Torvik and his guards lay unconscious, their weapons disabled. The warlord's fleet outside had been completely shut down, floating aimlessly in the nebula. But Lyra was gone. Aftermath. Jake sat alone in the sanctuary's central chamber, the faint glow of the core the only light. His chest felt hollow, the weight of Lyra's sacrifice pressing down on him. She had saved countless lives, but at what cost? A faint shimmer caught his eye. He turned to see a small crystal glowing softly on the console where Lyra had stood. He picked it up, feeling a faint warmth emanating from it. Somehow, he knew it was a part of her, what remained of her energy, her essence. Jake closed his hand around the crystal, a determined look crossing his face. "You're not really gone," he murmured, "and I'll make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain." With the crystal in his pocket, Jake boarded the stellar wind one last time. As the ship powered up and prepared to leave the sanctuary, Jake glanced at the swirling nebula around him. Lyra's light had changed the galaxy, and he was determined to honor her legacy. The stellar wind disappeared into the stars, carrying Jake, and the faint hope that Lyra's story wasn't truly over, into an uncertain future.